Elise, Elise. She turned her neck to see someone beckoning at her from the back. The person was so far away that she couldn't recognize who it was, so she stopped in her tracks. She didn't know many people around except for those in church, and she hardly spoke to anyone. The person got closer and she discovered it was John, the prankster. What do you want, John?
Can't I say hello to you anymore? Where are you heading off to?
Nowhere in particular, I'm just taking a stroll. Elise badly wanted to take her stroll in peace.
Cool, I will join you.
John paused for a while before asking,
Are you okay, Elise? What do you mean by that question, huh? Nothing. I was tending to the flowers the other day and I saw you throwing up. Thought you were sick or something. You must be confused. Is this one of your pointless pranks? Elise was scarred, but she kept a straight face and kept her voice cold and firm. No pranks, Missy. Just saying what I say. Maybe you should go to the hospital? You might be really sick. Plus, you look pale. Elise paused. Goodbye, John. I'll be heading back home right now. She passed him a tight smile. Have a nice night. And you too? She gritted. Although Elise marched back home confidently, her body was shaking all over. If John, who didn't stay at the house, always could notice such a thing, how much more Ruth? She and Ruth spent almost every minute of the day together. How about people in the church? Her boss, Pastor Rick?
Elise woke up with a banging headache. She felt dizzy and weak. She could hardly stand up from her bed, but she knew she couldn't lay in her bed all day. That would arouse suspicion. She didn't want any attention on her. Elise struggled to get on her feet. The house was empty. She looked in the kitchen, but Ruth wasn't there. That would save Elise a lot of time. She found a note on the table. It was Ruth's handwriting. I went to take Flora for her shots. We'll be back shortly. I made some eggs. Elise went back to the room. She stopped in front of her mirror with her hands on her stomach. She started at her reflection as she pulled her shirt up. She has been keeping her stomach hidden by wrapping a thick piece of cloth she bought at the store. It wasn't enough, but it did the work. At night, she would loosen it to free herself and then lie on her stomach. That way, even if Ruth walked in, she wouldn't suspect a thing. Still in front of the mirror, she wondered if all the stress was worth it. Yesterday was the only time Pastor Rick spoke to her in a long time. He was returning from work and met Elise at the door. Hi, Elise. You look good. Welcome, Pastor Rick. That was only what she said because she was in shock. Why would he say that she looked good when she had just had a round of spitting coupled with vomiting? She knew she looked like shit as she was coming down with a fever. Elise felt angry and betrayed. What happened to all the promises that Pastor Rick made to her? Yes, he told her how much he liked her. Now she was pregnant, bloated and ugly, but he wouldn't even look her in the face. What if it wasn't his fault? After all, she hasn't told anyone of the baby growing in her. The thoughts invaded her mind. It all began the week Ruth traveled to visit her extended family. They raised Ruth after her mother died. There had been a wedding, so she went for a week. Elise was left at home with Pastor Rick because there was an event to plan that weekend, and Ruth had put Elise in charge. The day Ruth left, Pastor Rick struck up a deep conversation with her. It was just like the first time they met. Elise couldn't get rid of those butterflies in her belly. She felt recognized and special when he spoke with her. You know how busy I am, Elise. We haven't had enough time to talk or go over things. He was sprawled on the sofa with the remote in his hands. Yes, I understand. I've learnt a lot since I got here. That's why Ruth could hand over the planning of the annual celebration to me. That's great. I always knew you were a smart girl. The compliment made Elise swoon once more. Have you ever been to the park? I know it's for kids, but we could go there tomorrow if you don't mind. He looked over at her. She was sitting on the sofa opposite him. Well, she stuttered. No one had ever invited her except Ruth. Yes, of course. That night she had barely slept. She tossed and turned. The only person she could think about was Pastor Rick. She woke up really early the following day. Elise tried on all the clothes Ruth had bought for her. It was a lot and she had nowhere to wear them except church, and use was quiet. Elise had just finished cleaning and packing up the last set of wine glasses when Pastor Rick stood by the door watching her. That was a great job you did here tonight. Thank you. I have received so many compliments. My cheeks are weak from smiling all day. Pastor Rick laughed. I get that too. You know you have to put on a happy face always. You have a pretty smile, so you shouldn't worry about anything. Once again, Pastor Rick was smooth with his constant showering of praise and compliments. Elise gifted him a small smile. Now that looks nice. Thank you. Ruth called some minutes ago. She told me the wedding went well. Yes, we've talked too. I wonder why you call Ruth by her name but insist on calling me Pastor Rick. Is that partiality or preference? Wait, I think Ruth is your favorite. Jealous much? Elise cackled as she wiped her hands dry. It just comes easy. Whatever you say, let's have a little celebration. He raised a bottle of wine.
Oh, okay. She followed him to the dining table and they sat there. As she took small sips from her glass of wine, she looked everywhere but at him. She sat there doing nothing. She felt his eyes on her as always, so she tried looking at him. Are you still shy? He smirked at her. No, I was never shy. She retorted. True, but since you got here, you've been extremely shy. You don't even talk to me. It's not like you talk to me too. That's true. I really like you, Elise. Why do you think I spoke to you that day? I admire everything about you. That particular moment broke every restraint Elise might have had. He smiled at her, that same charming smile that rendered Elise breathless and speechless. Elise swooned over him for a few minutes before calling herself to order. Huh, I don't think you should be saying that. You are a married man. I know. Some things can't be kept hidden. I just had to say it. Elise giggled and they continued drinking. 1 bottle of wine became 2, and 2 became 3. They were wasted. They continued chatting and the rest was history. Ruth came back the next morning and everything went back to default settings. She and Pastor Rick never spoke about that moment again. They hardly talked. Shortly after, baby Flora was born. Elise jolted back to the present. She found herself sprawled on the floor. She must have drifted off to sleep again. This time, her head banged furiously. She got up, rewrapped her stomach, and made her way to complete her chores. Keys rattled against the door, and Ruth came in. Hey, Elise, you slept in. Yes, thank you for the eggs. I loved them. That was a lie. She felt nauseous when she was about to eat the eggs, so she flushed it all instead. It's nothing. Flora was a good girl today. She didn't cry much, and she has fallen asleep. Ruth noticed dripping water from Elise's hands. Were you busy? Not really, just doing the dishes. All right, are you sure you are okay? You don't look too good. Yeah, I am, Elise snapped. Oh, okay, I got you some chips, your favorite. Ruth handed the bag to Elise. Elise collected the bag and felt herself wobble. She held on to the next thing she could grab hold of. Ruth rushed to support her and lead her to the sofa. You are burning up, Elise. You have a fever. Ruth's voice sounded far off as though she was speaking from a distance. Elise zoned in and out for the next minute. Her stomach twinged in pain and she felt something liquid trickle down her legs. Elise struggled to look down as her sight felt hazy. The liquid was red, it was blood. Ruth screamed out loud. In a split second, Elise's eyesight went dim and she could only see pitch black. Elise woke up to the sound of people talking and white light blinding her sight. She squinted before adjusting to the bright room. To her side was Ruth. Ruth had her head bowed, so she didn't know Elise was awake. Ruth, Elise managed to whisper. Her mouth was dry. Ruth looked up at her. The look was not of concern, neither was it the friendly look she was used to. Ruth was perplexed. It was really evident. Elise swallowed hard. Her mouth felt dry. Water, please? Ruth passed her a bottle of water without uttering a word. Elise gulped down the water while stealing glances at Ruth. She knew she was at the hospital, the smell of antiseptics and bleach. Elise knew she was in trouble. There was no more hiding or pretense. Elise, since when have you known? Elise shifted her gaze at Ruth. She was looking directly at her, scrutinizing her and giving her the death glare simultaneously. Ruth hardly got mad at anyone, but the few times she lost her cool, it had been ugly. Ruth, Elise took a deep breath in. You what? I'm so sorry. That was all that came out of Elise's mouth. She couldn't bring herself to say anything else. She feared that if she did, uncontrollable tears will spill down her eyes. It was bad enough that she was pregnant, but even worse that it belonged to Ruth's husband. That is not enough, Elise. Do you know you are pregnant? Ruth's hands were clasped tightly and placed on the hospital bed. Yes. Oh. Ruth's face showed she couldn't contain her shock. Do you know for how long? Not exactly. I don't know the exact time, maybe 5 months. Elise picked at her nails. Her heart thumped against her ribcage harder. Ruth would ask who was responsible, and she would have no choice but to tell her the truth. Where does that put her? I would say we should wait for the doctor, but I'll tell you everything right now, after which I expect you to do right by telling me the truth. Do you understand? Ruth stated sternly. I do. Elise nodded in reply. She had to dance to Ruth's tune as she was the piper currently. Dr. Thomas informed me that you are pregnant, which of course you do know. He was able to stop the bleeding on time. The babies are safe. Babies? Did you say babies, Ruth? Yes, you have a set of twins on the way. I hope that makes you happy. With that aside, who is responsible for your pregnancy? I demand a response from you, young lady. Ruth, I don't know, she blurted out. That was her safe ticket at the time. She just said it without knowing why. What do you mean you don't know? That's it, I don't know. Ruth clamped her mouth shut when Dr. Thomas walked into the ward. Hello, Elise. Hello, Mrs. Ross. The doctor beamed as he greeted them. Hello? The ladies responded in unison. Elise, I am Dr. Thomas. I will be attending to you. Currently, you are 6 weeks pregnant. The bleeding stems from a threatening miscarriage. I was able to save the condition. However, you need enough rest. Threatened miscarriage could be a result of stress. Do you understand? Yes, I do, doctor. Thank you.
Yeah. You will be discharged as soon as possible. However, you have to come back regularly for checkups and antenatal. This is pending the time the babies would be delivered. Congratulations. Thank you, Ruth replied curtly. Dr. Thomas proceeded to leave the room. He stopped in his tracks and said, Also, a little reminder to loosen the bandages. Not good for your condition. He passed her a small smile, then walked out. As they returned home from the hospital the next morning in Pastor Rick's car, the whole car was quiet, and there was tension in the air. This was unlikely, because they were used to talking and cracking jokes whenever they were in the car. Elise could swear that she felt her ears tingle from the silence that rented the place. Today she couldn't look outside the window to admire little kids, buildings, or people walking. It was because Elise had no choice but to confess. The Rosses had hardly uttered any words to each other, except from the little mumblings while leading Elise to the car. Even baby Flora could read the room. She wasn't crying or making baby noises. The three of them avoided eye contacts. Elise looked at Ruth one time and saw hurt and disappointment in her eyes. They got home and Elise went straight to her room. She stared at the ceiling for a long time while anticipating her next step. She knew she could no longer stay at the Ross's place after giving birth, especially when the truth comes out. No one could allow a homebreaker in their homes. There was a rap on her door and Ruth walked in. Elise, it's time to talk. Ruth rested against the wall and folded her arms tightly. Elise sat up, but kept her head bowed. She couldn't bring herself to look into Ruth's eyes. She started with apologies. I am sorry, Ruth. I am truly sorry for letting this happen. Things were never meant to happen this way. I am truly sorry. Can you please forgive me? Forgive you? I just want to know who is responsible for your pregnancy. We have to meet whoever it is before we decide on the next step. I know. I will tell you who it is, but you have to forgive me first. Look, Elise, Ruth spoke loudly and angrily. I'm not in the mood to play games. Go straight to the... Pastor Rick. Elise cuts in. She could no longer hold it in. Her voice wobbled and her heart shattered into pieces. It was after blurting out Pastor Rick's name that the gravity of what she had done dawned on her. Ruth froze. She didn't even blink an eye. Rick? What about Rick? Are you saying? Elise looked at Ruth as she tried to piece what Elise had just said together. I am so sorry. Elise fell on her knees. She burst into tears as she held on to Ruth. Ruth detached herself from her countless times, but Elise kept holding on. Ruth was in anguish. She yelled, shouted and cursed. Elise knew Pastor Rick was close by and he could hear it all, but they never came into the room, neither did he show his face. At last, Ruth was able to remove herself from her grips. She must have hurried into their room and confronted Pastor Rick, because the next thing Elise held was raised voices and banging noises. Ruth was used to scattering things whenever she got angry. Elise wailed while sprawled on the floor. Baby Flora didn't help matters as she raised her voice to join in the crying and shouting.